Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the second King Point. Mr. Hill on screen. I know that he's absent today. I understand that Mr. Conn is listening in. If there are any matters that need to be conveyed to Bill, he will do so. Can we start with first of all, two documents which I've received this morning: 5-year housing land supply position statement, and also a note relating to two documents before the local plan exam.
I don't know if other council or others had the same problem. I was barely hearing the inspector then.
Yeah, he sounded like a robot.
He looks to have dropped off anyway.
All right.
I think he's got a problem with his internet or his broadband connection, so he'll probably be joining again shortly.
Yeah, there is that.
So you appear to have frozen on my screen. I don't know if others are experiencing the same difficulty.
Yes, I have the same issue.
I can see and hear the both of you perfectly, so it's obviously inspector's difficulty.
Now, but still got problems. Can I establish whether I can be heard?
With some difficulty, sir, your screen is frozen and we're not picking you up perfectly. It's quite broken.
I'll leave back in. This is the first time it's ever happened to me, so bear with me.
Inspector can't join.
An afternoon's contingency.
Yeah. Yeah.
Am I back?
You are, sir. That's much better.
I'm aware of an intermittent problem. In fact, there will be an email coming through to you shortly to say that I was adjourning until 10:30, but just as that email was sent, my connection has been re-established. I know what the issue is. It's relative to the department's security package, which was causing interruptions for most of yesterday to me, which meant that I was losing connection. The help desk attended to it about 4 o'clock yesterday afternoon, and I had an hour and a half of not being broken. It seems to have reoccurred this morning. I think what I'll do is carry on now. If the security element drops out again and I'm cut out, then I will adjourn and contact the help desk to see whether they can resolve it for me. So we'll see how we progress. It is something that affects a lot of inspectors from time to time on a very intermittent basis. So I'm hoping that this morning is just one such occasion and we can continue. Now, in terms of my opening, I don't know how much you managed to hear and see, but I think I got to a position of saying that 2 documents had been submitted overnight, and I was going to ask Mr. Edwards whether he wished to comment on them in any way. Mr. Edwards.
Yes, sir. Thank you. Could I just check that you and particularly others have got the documents that you referred to? There was an email sent by Miss Lawrence last night. I'm just going to open it on my other screen. And it had attached to it 2 documents. One was a document entitled 5-Year Housing Land Supply Position Statement, dated yesterday, and that seeks to provide the clarification that was sought by the Rule 6 parties concerning core document B14. And secondly, there's a short note that responds to a matter that was left over for clarification following questions put in cross-examination last week to Mr. Lowndes concerning documents that were part of the evidence base for the local plan examination and what the local plan inspector had been told about the further work that the council was undertaking. So unless it would be helpful for me to do so at this stage, I wasn't proposing to elaborate on either of those documents. They do, I hope, what they purport to do, and plainly if other parties have any comments to make on them, they'll address you in due course.
Thank you. Clearly, in light of that, it will be helpful to have a response from Infrared and from Basildon Estates. Mr. Lyness, do you anticipate that you will wish to respond to that in view of the position taken by your clients on housing land supply?
So I think I'll need to reserve our position on that. I suspect that the way we will try and deal with this is for Mr. Harris to cover this, hopefully very briefly in his evidence in chief, by way of summarising what we may want to put in writing before the close of the inquiry. As you'll be aware, our position at the outset of the inquiry was not to get involved in site-specific debate, and my instinct is that we will remain of that position, notwithstanding that quite a lot of more information has been put in now by the council, but we will reflect on that hopefully this afternoon, and then, as I've mentioned, deal with it as efficiently as we can, either in Mark Harris's evidence or in a written document we submit to the inquiry.
Thank you. Ms. Hall?
So thank you. Yes, obviously, so you'll be aware we ran our case specifically on the fact of a sort of absence of evidence point. The council's now taken an opportunity about 5 days into this inquiry to submit a slew of new evidence. There's 46 pages of additional evidence on site-specific matters. Had we known that was going to happen, so we did flag up in our statement of case that if it was going to descend to that level of detail, we would want to call a witness on 5-year supply. We haven't done that. I haven't instructed that expert. And I found out last night that if we wanted to do that in order to rebut properly the evidence now put in by the council very late, that it would take Mr. Ireland 2 weeks to put together a proper response to that. So we feel we're not able to respond to this properly in time, and certainly within the time left with this inquiry. I'm not keen to add to people's costs or diaries and extend this inquiry. So we say, well, we're not able to respond to it properly. Given that, we're not going to ask you not to accept it, because it's before you, you've seen it, you've read it, I'm sure. So we don't think that would take us any further. But what we do ask is that there'd be something in your decision letter to note that this wasn't a point on which Infrared had an opportunity to provide a full rebuttal. So you'll be aware that what my clients are really concerned about is obviously our own appeal, and what would be really prejudicial to us is a finding by you of a 3.5-year supply based on this evidence when we haven't had a chance to rebut it, and then for the council to pop up in sort of 3 months' time at our inquiry and say, this issue's been dealt with, and you've had a pop at our 5-year supply once, and the inspector wasn't persuaded, and so you can't have another go. So we don't want the issue to be closed, essentially, sir.
I'm going to leave the matter for now, because I can anticipate that there will be accusations of who did what and when and why it's late, and that the information was brought into the inquiry as a response to queries that were raised at the very beginning of the inquiry. So I don't think that sort of debate is going to be helpful. My task is the more difficult one in terms of reaching a conclusion relative to the 5-year housing land supply, whether it's a particular figure or whether it's a range. And of course, that's important in terms of the weight to be applied to the shortfall in the overall planning balance. If we continue to have substantial dispute about the 5-year housing land supply, then I will not leave it at that. If it necessitates further inquiry time so that appropriate witnesses can be called, or whether it's possible to deal with it by written representations within a reasonable period of time, then I'll rule on that. But what I don't want to be left is in a completely invidious position of lack of information and a decision that's potentially vulnerable, because clearly that's not going to assist anybody either now or in the future. So I think it's something that you need to reflect upon, and once you've had time to do that, is to address me in due course. Does anybody wish to comment?
So could I just raise one point, and I think it may help you and Ms. Hall. I'm not going to get into the detail of who is responsible for this evidence coming in at this stage, because that's not going to help you in terms of your ultimate task. But can I just make it clear that so far as the council is concerned, with regard to any case that Ms. Hall's clients may advance at their own appeal, we will certainly not be seeking to preclude Infrared at their own appeal taking whatever point they choose to take with regard to 5-year housing land supply. And if they wish to run an argument at their own appeal next year concerning what the council's 5-year housing land supply position is, they're entitled to do that, and the inspector determined that appeal will be decided on the basis of their evidence. So I'm certainly not going to be, or the council is not going to be holding Infrared to anything that it says or doesn't say at this inquiry in terms of prejudicing whatever case it puts forward at its own inquiry. Now, so I say that in the spirit of trying to be constructive and to assist Ms. Hall and her clients in determining how they propose to proceed at this stage. And I hope, sir, that gives them some comfort.
Thank you. Ms. Hall, do you want to come back on that?
I'm very grateful to Mr. Edwards for that clarification. So I think what I need to do is probably take some instructions on how long it's going to take us to respond in writing. I think that's probably a proportionate way of doing it. I don't want to get into calling new witnesses. I think I'm going to ask Mr. Mumby how comfortable he feels with dealing with some of it. And it might be that we need an additional note in addition to Mr. Mumby's live evidence. And if Mr. Edwards is content with that way forward, I'll just make sure on timescales, if I may.
Clearly, it's going to assist if that can be dealt with as a written note. So in effect, that element is written representation, so that I have a clear indication of the parties' positions, and it may then be a matter left for closing submissions in light of what Mr. Edwards has said. I appreciate that the note came in last night, that clearly you've not had time to reflect upon it, and that's why I didn't want to get into a lot of detail this morning, because I don't think it's helpful, and that we can I can give you time to reflect, and we can come back and deal with it tomorrow or Thursday in terms of at least updating me where we are. Thank you. What else have we got in terms of housekeeping matters? Left over from the end of last week, Mr. Cafferty at some point is going to come back with a brief note relative to the calculation of the podium amenity space and the proportion of balconies. Program.
That's in hand, sir.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So the next element is program. And what did you decide in terms of option 1 and option 2 that were floating yesterday in terms of how we use today and tomorrow?
Sir, even before the new information had come in from the council, the view was that we would finish with Mr. Jackson today, and then come back tomorrow and call Ms. Roberts and then Mr. Harris. We think that's the most efficient way of dealing with matters. It also allows us, hopefully, some time this afternoon to reflect on the new material that's come in overnight, so that we can say what we need to say through Mr. Harris tomorrow, and take a position on when any written representations might be able to be submitted, sir.
Thank you. So that was agreed behind the scenes. I think yesterday it was put to be as to whether I had a preference, and I think it was conveyed to you that I didn't mind on the anticipation of completing 2 witnesses tomorrow if we opted for option 1.
That's right, sir. I had contacted Mr. Edwards yesterday morning and had useful discussion with him via email, and I put to him those options before it had been mentioned to you. So he's hopefully been aware of the position throughout yesterday. Thank you. And Ms. Hall, you're content with that, I take it?
So it doesn't affect us in the slightest.
No, I know. I didn't want to exclude anybody from the discussion.
That's very kind.
And I think a 9:30 start tomorrow, which then gives us a good time to deal with 2 witnesses. Thank you.
So
certainly, Mr. Edwards.
Sorry, sir. So to cut across you. So just 2 matters. Firstly, on timetabling, I'm perfectly content with the approach that Mr. Linus has indicated he would prefer to follow. So that does mean that we're going to have a short day today. And so just so you're aware, in light of the opportunity I had to cross-examine Mr. Cafferty last week, I'm going to be significantly shorter with Mr. Jackson than I'd anticipated, subject to anything coming out in evidence in chief. And so I would have thought, at the moment, I'm not going to be more than about half an hour with Mr. Jackson. So I thought it would be useful to make you and others aware of that at this stage. Secondly, sir, so far as the note that the appellant is preparing arising from Mr. Cafferty's evidence last week, so it would be helpful, I would certainly find it helpful to have that note before Ms. Brown gives her evidence tomorrow, if that's possible. So I'm not asking you to make a direction to that effect, but perhaps Mr. Linus would bear that in mind.
Thank you.
Sir, we will do that. Mr. Cafferty's in the room today, and if we have time this afternoon, we will make sure we progress that as quickly as we can.
Thank you. Perhaps somewhat premature, but has any thought been given to closings in light of the discussion we held at the end of last week?
Sir, yes, there have been initial discussions between Council on dates for closing. That hasn't reached a conclusion as yet. Perhaps the best thing to do is, once we finish Mr. Jackson today, we can revisit that through the course of today and come back to you tomorrow morning. We're looking at different dates at the moment. One option that has been mentioned is the 6th of December. There has been at least the possibility of looking at the 29th of November, but that, for my part, appears to be receding now. So the one date that had been discussed tentatively was the 6th of December, but we need to confirm that through further discussions later today.
Thank you. And I will check on my availability specifically for the 6th of December, just to make sure that if there's difficulty from my point of view, you're at least aware of it before you get final agreement.
Thanks. So I thought I would mention it, albeit on a highly provisional basis, so we can make some progress on that.
Certainly, yes. Thank you. Any other housekeeping matters before Mr. Jackson's called? If not, Mr. Linus, if you'd like to call Mr. Jackson, please.
Thank you very much. Sir, as you may anticipate, and as Mr. Edwards anticipated, a number of matters that are an issue between the parties already being canvassed and evidence that you'll be very familiar with already. So I will not be long with Mr. Jackson, just as Mr. Edwards not be long with Mr. Jackson either. But in that context, I'll introduce him to the inquiry I see appeared on screen. You are Timothy Richard Jackson. You're a chartered member of the Landscape Institute, director of the long-established award-winning multidisciplinary environmental design company, FPCR Environment and Design Limited. You practice as a member of the Landscape Institute, the Institute of Environmental Assessment and Management, and the Urban Design Group. And you've been a partner director of the practice for over 20 years. You have over 30 years experience of landscape and development projects from individual conceptual design through to final completion and long-term aftercare. You've advised on townscape, landscape and visual impact issues in a wide range of commercial, residential and mixed-use development schemes. And you've completed townscape, landscape character assessment work and capacity studies for local authority and private sector clients. And at 1.3 of your proof, you refer to a range of projects, including new garden villages, sustainable urban extensions, town centre and public realm projects you've been involved in, which I need not list there. And you explain that FPCR provided the townscape, landscape and visual consultancy services for the appeal scheme, including the TVIA submitted with the environmental statement. Are all those details correct? Yes, they are. Very much. Now, as with previous witnesses, what I would like to do is just to cover the main propositions that you'd like to place before the inspector by way of a series of headings. I'm taking your evidence as read, but referring to particularly visual material as necessary as we go through, if that's acceptable, sir.
It is, yes, thank you.
Thank you very much. So the first heading I'd like to cover, please, Mr. Jackson, is the TVIA work that was carried out, the townscape and visual work that was carried out as part of the application. Just explain the process that was followed, please, by way of introduction.
Okay. Well, the townscape and visual impact assessment work was undertaken in accordance with sort of recognised guidelines, the Guidelines for Landscape and Visual Impact Assessment, 3rd edition, which I'm sure you're familiar with, sir.
I am indeed, yes, thank you.
Often referred to as GLIVIA. So the assessment was conducted on that basis. In terms of the methodology and scope, that was all agreed as part of the environmental statement scoping process. I think in particular, the visual aspect and the views, there was close consultation with the council's officers in terms of identifying those views and representative views that we should consider as part of that process. And that resulted in 22 viewpoint locations from various directions, various distances, both within the town centre and beyond. And they formed the basis, certainly, of the viewpoints and the visual analysis that was conducted as part of the TVIA. And then subsequently, just in terms of those viewpoints, there was further agreement on those viewpoints that we should use to model the visualizations of the scheme, and also the types of visualizations, be they, again, I'm sure you're familiar with them, sir, be they wire lines or matting diagrams. So that was all agreed very comprehensively, no issues with it, and I think there's been no issues subsequently with certainly the approach and the methodology that had been adopted by the TVIA.
Thank you very much. Second heading, please, is existing townscape character. Now, we've heard quite a lot about this already at the inquiry, so I think we can have as a summary of your position, reflecting on the evidence that's already been heard. Can you summarise for the inspector, please, how you have looked at existing townscape character as part of your own assessment work, please?
Clearly, we've looked at a character assessment on the basis of Glivia 3. I mean, and we've quite clearly, we have heard a lot already. So I think in almost in summary, what I'd probably say, and there's probably one or two points to add and flesh out what's already been said, but I think in summary, we've got a town centre, townscape here that's sort of clearly and principally sort of shaped and structured by the sequence of spaces, that sort of central east-west axis that we've heard about, and connected sort of squares and spaces. So we have Town Square and St Martin's Square and East Square that sort of lie along that east-west axis. So I think that's the sort of principal sort of structuring element, and that's a sort of clearly a positive aspect of the town centre, is that axis. I think clearly the new town origins have clearly again shape the character. Still a retail sort of dominated town centre, albeit that there are other uses now. Obviously the recent cinema, the college building, the civic uses that we've got in the western part of the town, sort of around St Martin's Square. We've got the church and the library and the council offices and the theatre. So there are other uses, but principally still sort of retail dominated. And I think the other sort of important point is that it's still quite inward facing. We have the fairly sizable peripheral car parking areas, be they multi-storey car parking or at ground level car parking. And I think beyond that, clearly we've still got the sort of the ring road position. So I think connectivity between the town centre and those residential areas and the sort of almost the townscape beyond the sort of town centre is something that clearly is lacking in terms of good connectivity. I think and I think probably what I would just add to keep it fairly succinct is that I think the urban characterisation and design review study, CDB6, and again I know we've been there previously, but I think the paragraphs, and I don't think we need to turn it up, so but the two paragraphs 3.130 and 3.131, I think they are. I think that provides a fair and good summary of that characterisation. I think that flags sort of civic status as a distinctive aspect of the town centre, the tired air of the centre, the paling sort of physical fabric. And I think importantly, again, already quoted it on a number of occasions, the sort of tall buildings set adjacent to the low to medium buildings, which again, I think is I think that is a fair summation, certainly in respect of the heights of the buildings at the moment across the town centre.
In dealing with heights, you've included an image in Appendix 2 to your proof, Mr. Jackson, of the town centre and buildings, and perhaps you can just take that out and explain what you would like the inspectors to take away in relation to heights when looking at existing townscape character, please.
Have you got that, sir?
I have. There's two oblique aerials of the town centre.
The first image, I think I'm looking at that at the moment. Again, a few matters to note. I suppose a couple in addition to heights, but just in terms of heights, you can clearly see there's a range of heights across the town centre. I mean, I would say that the tall buildings are evident across the town centre. But I think what's also apparent is that that there's more than a handful of sort of medium sort of height buildings. So as opposed to this being a town centre with tall buildings and say 2 to 4 stories that pervading sort of character, this is very much a sort of town centre that has the tall buildings with I would say sort of a range of what are low to medium sort of height buildings, so sort of 2 almost to 6 or 7 story heights. Because as you look across the image, And if we start almost on the left-hand side of that image, again, some certain things aren't labelled up, but the far left-hand side, that is where the new approved GS8 11-storey building would sit. We've then got the Basildon Courts and Regent House, which are sort of north of Broadmain. Again, not labelled up, but there's then, as you're moving from left to right, there's then a sort of a brick building immediately to the left of Great Oaks House, which we've not labelled, but that's Acorn House, again, 5 to 7 stories. Then got Great Oaks House at 11 stories. The multi-storey car parks, which again are fairly clear and obvious in this image, there are 5 stories. And then obviously Brook House, you can see 14 stories, and then be up just behind and to the right of Brook House is Kelting House, 9 stories. What hasn't been highlighted is there's a dark, sort of dark linear sort of block that sits on top of Northgate House, which is, I think now is sort of clad in the sort of blue and yellow and grey cladding. Again, that part of Northgate House is sort of 6 stories. And as you can continue across, I won't continue with all the heights, but they do, you know, you've got 4, 5, 6 stories, and then you move across further to the right and you've got Trafford House, which I think is currently 8 stories, but we just had the recent approval to extend that up to 11. And then the Icon building at 10 stories. And in addition to just that range of heights, which I think is different from what might have been suggested was the prevailing character by Mr. Lowndes, in so much as, yes, there are tall buildings, but I think even that range below the tall buildings is certainly a greater range there than there used to be. But also, just to add very quickly, I think just looking at the forms of the buildings, again, there's quite a number that are stepped and vary quite a bit. Basildon Centre, you can see at sort of the bottom of the image, stepped, and the theatre stepped, and equally a number of the other buildings are sort of quite sort of stepped and not all with horizontal flat roof forms. And then the final point, just while we've got this turned up, sir, again, probably just materials. And I think you can quite evidently see, just looking across that, the range and probably the prevalence in some respects of the buff brick and the red brick and the dark brick. So I think to take away, I think it's probably there's the variety on a number of levels in townscape terms.
Thank you. Okay. Is there anything about, we've mentioned the strong east-west connectivity as well. As far as north-south connectivity and links generally, Mr. Jackson, to what extent are they sort of relevant to consideration of townscape character of the existing position?
I think very relevant to the certainly the connectivity and linkages. I mean, yeah, it's fair to say we've got a very strong east-west link through the centre of the town. The north-south links that sort of connect with that east-west link, and then to the north towards the residential areas beyond to the north, and also to the south, the rail station area and beyond to those residential areas is in my view sort of very poor at the moment. I mean, clearly the road causes a sort of severance problem and issue, but I think there's just the general sort of legibility and means of almost finding your way into the town centre is very poor.
Okay, we'll come back to that when looking at views. And you've had a view over the town centre generally in your Appendix 2. Do you draw any distinction between west and east as far as the town centre is concerned and its character?
Yeah, certainly there's a few clear differences between west and east. I think the western end, and again, I think sort of general terms, it's also accepted by Lowndes, is that there's more variety at the western end. I mean, clearly we've got the sort of civic uses down there. but there's more variety in a number of ways, again, just in terms of the built forms and materials on the one hand, and also the uses. It's also, the West End is of a relatively larger sort of grain and scale, urban grain and scale, than the sort of more enclosed sort of eastern part of the town centre. So I'd suggest they're probably the main differences. I think there is that greater variety just in terms of the urban sort of characteristics and features within that sort of western part of the town centre.
Thank you very much. Now, move on to the third sort of heading, please, which is views. And within this, let's break this down. We know that in your PVIA within the ES that you split views into long, mid to long, and then town centre and surrounds. We also know that the council is only taking an issue with views within the town centre itself, but notwithstanding that, can you just briefly explain to the inspector what approach you took to the long and the mid to long views? I know there are views throughout the environmental statement, but can you highlight the ones that you think the inspector should look at to have a flavour for the overall approach you've taken to long and mid to long views, please?
Well, I think in terms of the long, sort of mid to long views, it might be easiest. I've got a few extracts within my proof of evidence. So on page 27, 28, 29, we've got some extracts there. I don't know. The one thing I'm not too sure about in relation to those extracts is the resolution of them, sir. So I don't know if you refer to, say, page 27, there's an extract there of Viewpoint 2 for my evidence. The version that I've got printed out isn't the best resolution. I mean, it might suffice for me to explain things, and I can certainly point you to where that view is within the environmental statement, if that would help.
Perhaps what we can do is we can look at the image in the proof and then give the page reference to help the inspector.
So just in terms of the distant views, this viewpoint is taken from the higher ground, quite some distance to the north of the town centre. This is approximately 4 kilometres away. So I think views that are within the environmental statement, views 1 to 3, are all very distant to the north. I think what I would say, probably useful for you to take away, sir, is that just in relation to the sort of mid to long range views, I suppose that they vary as you sort of move around the sort of orientation clock, sort of north, south, east, west. I think because we've got higher ground to the north, although distantly to the north, and there's higher ground to the south, generally where you've got the long views, it is generally from the north and the south. There are some east and west, but in general, that's where, if there are views, that generally from those directions. And that has a bearing just in terms of how the development is seen in relation to other tall buildings. So for instance, it's certainly in relation to Brook House, because they sit along an east-west axis. If the views are coming from the north and the south, generally greater distance between those elements. So the greater distance between Brook House and the scheme as such. So that's one point. But just in terms of these general views, the town centre is visible, including sort of Brook House and most of the other tall town centre buildings, even at this distance. So they're visible, set within a very broad, expansive context. So you've only got a small extract of the view here, which extends for some distance, certainly to the left and the right of what's within the proof. So it's a very expansive view. It's got other industrial and residential development in much further afield, but it's a fairly strong landscape setting. But the town centre sits relatively low. But you do, even at this distance, you do read the tall buildings within the town centre. I suppose that in terms of the slightly closer views, so if you turn the page onto page 28, we've got a viewpoint. If you've got that sort of viewpoint, an extract of viewpoint 8. This is one taken from within Gloucester Park. sort of an elevated position within Gloucester Park, approximately a kilometre to the north of the town centre. So again, just in terms of what you can see, the top image shows what you can see of the town centre from this particular position. Again, I think people in and around Gloucester Park, it's often a kinetic experience, people moving around. This isn't from a particular viewpoint as such, this is moving along a path. There's a lot of wooded areas and woodland blocks within this particular part of Gloucester Park. So the view changes quite a lot as you move around. At times you see, quite clearly the other tall buildings, Trafford around the station, including Trafford House and the Icon. But in this view, you can see clearly Brook House. Great Oaks House sits virtually merging with it. You can it almost looks like one building, but there's two buildings. We've got Brook House and Great Oaks House sitting to the right, but almost merging with it. And you can also see Kelting House, the sort of 9-storey development that sort of sits in the sort of southeast of the town centre. And then the image below, which has been produced as a sort of a massing visualization. So this isn't fully rendered, so it doesn't convey the actual detail and colours of the development, the proposed development. On that view below, you can see the proposed development sitting to the right of Brook House and Great Oaks House, and you can see it above the tree line. But again, quite clearly separate from Brook House and Great Oaks House. But that gives you an understanding of the likely sort of visual presence of the development within these sort of closer views from Gloucester Park to the south. But as has been said, the council are taking no issue with these sort of mid and longer range views.
And just to be clear, the view 2 that we were looking at before, so that's figure 7.10 within C13 PDF page 322 if you need to look at the larger version, and then view 8 that we're looking at, C13 figure 720, 721 PDF pages 332 and 333. As far as viewpoint 8 is concerned, Mr. Jackson, obviously the council isn't taking a point here, but what was your overall judgment as far as visual effects were concerned from view 8, and can you explain the basis for that judgment, please?
So our overall judgment was that this would provide a minor beneficial effect. Again, I think once you take into account how the buildings will actually be perceived, once we've got this sort of high quality developments in place, I mean, our view is that they add sort of character and composition of the town centre. They will provide a sort of visual reference and marker to the western part of the town core, and I think as an overall sort of composition visual skyline for the visual skyline, we feel that they will be beneficial in these views.
Okay, let's move to the town centre, please. And you covered the town centre and surrounds again in the environmental statement, the TVIA. But can we just select the ones that you would like to identify for the inspector, please? If we stick with your proof, you have some closer range views identified at page 29. Can you just sort of summarise the inspector how you'd like him to approach particular town centre views, please?
Well, I think in terms of the closer views and the town centre views, I think this is where there's almost a greater variety in terms of what you do see of all the respective buildings, including Brook House, and equally what you'll see of the appeal scheme. It varies quite considerably as you get closer to the town centre. Apart from some of the other viewpoints, but again, if I just use these examples, we've got viewpoint 11, which is taken from Gloucester Park development. It's taken from, this is on page 29, so the top two views. You can see in the top view, the existing view, this is taken from a sort of almost a grassed mound within the park that's associated with this fairly recent residential area. And you can see in this, the existing, you've got Great Oaks House and Brook House, and then you've got the Millennium sort of bell tower and the Basil and council offices. So you can see, and you've also got the sort of, what is it, sort of four-storey residential development in the foreground. And I think in terms of what to take away, we've added in on the bottom view, again, the proposed development massing. Again, I think what I would say is that in our view, that sort of adds positively to what you can see. I mean, certainly in terms of where it sits, it forms I think a well sort of balanced sort of arrangement of the series of new towers that sort of sits again at the western end of the town, marking the sort of almost the civic core of the town. And I think, as you can see in terms of the legibility and sort of wayfinding and moving into the town centre, it does sit at a very suitable position within this view, and quite clearly separate from Brookhouse that you see over to the left.
And again, we know that council doesn't take issue with these slightly longer range views outside the town centre, but can we just on that basis use viewpoint 11 to illustrate a couple of points? So when one's looking at the impact of new development on an existing tall building, just run through the factors which you say are relevant to the judgment which needs to be made. So if we run through a couple, I mean, to what extent in your view is the location of a building behind or to the side of an existing tall building relevant when judging impact?
I think that's, that is relevant and very relevant. I think, and where one building or one proposed development is being viewed or seen in conjunction with another, and the sort of separation is important. I think, if you are sitting in front or behind, there's that there is potential for sort of competition and merging depending on the nature and style of the developments and the materials used. But I think certainly if you've got distance and there's certainly space between them, I think there's far less chance of there being potentially any competition. I think in general, as I alluded to earlier, because many of the views are sort of from the north and the south, there is generally that sort of separation, certainly between the appeal scheme and Brookhouse, although inevitably, as you move around, it will be seen probably closer to or alongside, but certainly in terms of the closer views, I think they're very variable. Okay,
so let's go, as we said, to town centre, please. I think U13 is one that you've included in your town centre and surrounds views within the environmental statement. Is that right?
It is, yeah. So
yeah, think of U13 then, please.
So again, so if you're still within my evidence, though, the bottom two photographs, you've got the existing view. This is taken from Broadmain, just the sort of, I suppose, the northeast of the town centre, and in that you can see again we've got the fire station tower, Brookhouse, and Great Oaks House clearly evident. What is almost emerging just on the far right hand side is, I think that's where we've got Acorn House. I think may possibly being constructed at that stage. But I think this is where you can see how within the closer views there is much greater variety, because I think that bottom image we have superimposed again the development massing of our appeal scheme. And again, although we do sit beyond Brookhouse in that image, it is quite recessive and noticeably lower because of just the nature of some of these closer views. The scheme was noticeably lower, and certainly in terms of any competition or visual conflict with Brookhouse or even with Great Oaks House. I think you can see that it occupies a fairly recessive position in those views, and there isn't that competitional threat with Brookhouse in those views.
Okay, and then if we move around to viewpoint 15 from the eastern end of East Walk, one can note that view 13 was in CDC 13, figures 7.33 to 34, PDF pages 345 and 346. If we move on to view 15, Again, that's ES figure 7.40, PDF pages 351, 352 of CDC 13. But looking at the image in your proof, Mr. Jackson, what would you ask inspector to take away in summary from this view, please? One can note, actually, before you answer that, one sees in that picture that the cinema appears to be under construction in that view. Is that right?
It is, yeah. You can see the frame, the steel frame on the right-hand side of East Walk there. Where that's the.
So obviously, this will be a matter the inspector will have seen this and already. But as far as this view is concerned, please, what you ask to take away from this?
Well, I think, I mean, clearly, again, as with most of these views, we're talking about, again, kinetic experiences. So certainly, in terms of moving along East Walk, I think that will be obviously important for the inspector to take account of. I think what I'd say here is that I think this partly comes down to I suppose the design, development, and response of the scheme to its location within the town centre and its relationship with Brook House. But we've got the wire line extent of the proposed development going on the left-hand side of East Walk. I think because of the way the SWOT team designed the scheme and stepped up the fingers from those that one that's closest to the Brook House to the western end, so stepping up from sort of east to west. And what you see there, that sort of the wire line, that is the 17 stories at the western end of the scheme. So I think that partly shows, the response in terms of keeping that relatively lower in terms of the proximity to Brook House. But what I'd suggest is that I think the scheme, along that view, I think it would provide a certain degree of balance to the view. I mean, if you imagine the sort of cinema complex finished now. I mean, again, it is relatively low just in terms of how you view the scheme from here. I think as you move down East Walk, things will change. I think probably one of the things you will find is that Brook House itself will probably almost disappear from view behind the cinema complex. I mean, clearly the proposed development will sort of probably, its presence will increase gradually, but certainly by the time if you move down the East Walk in a westerly direction, as you get to East Square, I mean, that's clearly Brook House that's where it's readily apparent, and the appeal scheme certainly won't have any challenging sort of emphasis or cause any issues with those clear views of Brook House from East Square.
Thank you very much. Now, perhaps we can turn to an image within your TVIA, but does not appear in your proof, and it's view 18 from the railway station. Please, if we go to CDC 13, please, and figures 7.39 to 7.40.
It might be 746 to 747. Sorry, I think that's
my mistake.
That's my mistake. Viewpoint 18, 746, 747.
Sorry, that's PDF pages.
I think that's 358 and 359.
358 and 359. Okay, so let's explain to the inspector what you asked him to draw from this viewpoint as well, so far as it's indicating views from the railway station itself.
Have you got there, sir?
I have. I'm there. Thank you.
Okay, very good. So in terms of 746, this is the existing sort of view from the train sort of platform, sort of south side of the platform, looking across in the general direction of the site with Brook House on the right. I mean, what I would say just in general from the actual station platforms themselves, there's a relatively good screen and filter of existing trees and vegetation that extends for quite some distance up and down the sort of platforms. But you do get, glimpses, and there are views towards the town centre. So in this view, we've got the sort of general extent of the site on the left-hand side. You can see part of the existing building that's on site with the, I think, Northgate house, the sort of yellow, blue, grey cladding of Northgate House beyond. You can see those sort of on the sort of left-hand side. To the right-hand side, you've got the Eastgate Centre with Brook House beyond, and probably just off, in fact, just off the view to the right, you've got Kelting House as well, which again, just because of the nature of the viewpoints, that's sort of not on this one. I think in terms of what I would want the inspector to take away is, I think this is probably, this comes back almost to the, I suppose, the legibility sort of point and waymarking and benefits of the scheme, just in terms of marking that western part of the town centre and the benefits that will come from that. And clearly, looking at this view, and I think that probably the one thing to say also is that this is the platform view. I think it's important that we take in the sort of forecourt view. So I think as you drop down from the platform, the forecourt, I think that's where the inspector probably needs to look at that as well. And I think so we've almost got two different things, and I think probably almost the forecourt view is the I suppose the location that probably warrants more clearly sort of the waymarking, the legibility in relation to the town centre. But I think what I would say, and if you turn the page to 747, again, where we've superimposed again the basic massing of the development, I think again you can see, I mean, well, firstly we're set quite separately from Brook House, but I think you can see there that clearly there are waymarking sort of buildings and references that the building is apparent, and I think certainly people would read that as a way sort of into the town centre. I think that's probably more the case from the forecourt. So I think in terms of any further visits you've got to the site, I think in terms of the forecourt, when you're down at forecourt level, certainly at present, you're faced with a fairly blank facade of the colours nightclub. And I think although Mr. Lowndes said you can use signs and landscaping to assist with legibility and waymarking, I think there's certain times and instances where certainly development itself is important in terms of certainly where we're looking at these key connections and key waymarking features. So I think the view sort of shows where the development would sit within the town centre positively. Again, separate from Brook House. I think it clearly shows an emphasis to that western civic side of that certainly in terms of linkages into the town will be important.
Thank you very much. And perhaps in that context, please, first of all, the judgments that you've reached in the TVIA, both in relation to view 15 and view 18, just summarise what view you reached on visual impact, first of all, please.
I think for both of those schemes, certainly if we start with the station, I think we've assessed that as a moderate beneficial effect, and principally because it's going to greatly improve the legibility, but also I think it's going to mark that western civic part of the town, and it's going to add to the overall sort of presence and composition of the taller buildings within the town centre.
And in that context, please, can we just take out briefly CEB7, which is the Town Centre Master Plan Urban Appraisal Revision A, and go to internal page 46 within that.
Sorry, Mr. Linus, could you just give that document reference again, please?
CDB7. And it is the urban appraisal document. We made that, and it's internal page 46. Okay, now, Mr. Jackson, having a look at this section of the appraisal on movement, wayfinding and local issues, reference here to severance and key links, one sees the plan there. Just explain to the inspector what approach that you take to routes into the town centre here, and how the scheme fits with what is identified on the plan, please?
I think, as I've already said, certainly those north-south links and the severance of the road are particular issues for the town centre. This image that's covering the sort of key links and the wayfinding, it identifies essentially two sort of key routes in the south, and they both extend from the train station and the bus station to either side of the site. So the sort of western side along Fodderwick towards St Martin's Square, and then on the eastern side along sort of Market Pavement into Town Square. And I think that supports very well the approach that's been adopted by the appeal scheme. And I think particularly, just again back to almost the detailed design and the development of the scheme by the Swot Architects team. I think you can see that certainly with the taller elements of the proposed scheme on the northwest corner, fronting St Martin's Square, and also the slightly lower, but also sort of the taller sort of marker element on the southeast corner of the appeal scheme, fronting Market Square. I think you can see how that suitably responds to this wayfinding sort of plan, and I think that again the scheme will address, or will certainly respond to this in the right way.
You mentioned St Martin's Square. Can we move on to another view then, staying within the TVIA, and deal with St Martin's Square? CDC 13. I think you had the PDF numbered page 370, is it, Mr. Jackson?
Yes, I think it's the very last page.
Very well, very last page, and this is figure 7.58. Is that right?
It is, yeah.
Thank you. So again, what view do you take about effects in respect to Martin Square, please?
Well, I think you can see from the image, I mean, in this instance, this wasn't one of the views where the council sought a visualisation, but I think you can see from, so this is just the sort of existing view at the time. You can see where the development sits, the site sits. There's evidence of where you can see the sort of route towards the station down the right-hand side of the building. No real or indication of the route sort of round into the square. I think the benefit that will come from the scheme, just in terms of marking one position, adding some definition and enclosure to the St Martin's Square, will be clearly beneficial. Again, I think just in terms of the activation of the space, you've got some of the blank facades of I think it's the old M&S building on the sort of left-hand side of the view, with the Northgate House development sitting above it. I think the one thing to say also from this viewpoint is that you don't see Brook House position. I think probably just in terms of, again, don't necessarily need to turn it up, but I think if you look at this and then compare it with I think the very first image in Mr. Cafferty's presentation, I think it's not the front cover, I think it must be page 2, which is almost from I think it's probably set a little bit further back, because it's sort of, I think his image is taken from just beyond the Millennium Bell Tower. I think you can see from, in a comparison with this view and that, how the development will quite clearly benefit both in wayfinding, legibility terms, but also in terms of definition and providing a marker to this important part of the town centre.
Thank you very much. Now, just a couple of other matters beyond the views, please. The point has been raised by the council about the effect on Brook House in particular, and we've covered that as we've gone through the views. But can you just summarise for the inspector this issue, how you see the proposals relating to Brook House in the context of its existing rule and the issue of singularity that's been raised in the inquiry, please?
Well, I think in terms of how the scheme relates to Brook House in terms of its existing role. I mean, I think it very much, the appeal scheme very much complements it. I think it sort of provides a sort of marker reference at the western civic end of the town. It provides a balance with Brook House that sort of sits at the sort of eastern end of town square and sort of marks that the eastern part of the town. So I think it provides a balance which is beneficial. I think in terms of the singularity point, which again, I don't think that, well, my understanding was that Mr. Lowndes and the council are not pursuing this now. I think it was my understanding from after cross-examination, but I certainly don't see that there is a singularity role for Brook House. I mean, when it was first built, it was on its own as a tall building, but I think certainly from anything I've seen, there was no intention that it should just remain as a sole single building. And I think quite clearly nowadays it sits with many other tall buildings both close to and sort of around the town centre. I mean, particularly as we look through the images, I mean, Great Oaks House is, again, from what I can see and measure, is only 45 metres to the northwest of Brook House, and quite clearly in views it sits merging with it and alongside it, and there are other tall buildings. So I don't see that there's any sort of singularity of Brook House anymore.
Thank you very much. And as far as height as a sort of second issue is concerned, again, we've been through this as far as the images are concerned, but what approach do you suggest inspectors should take when looking at the height of the scheme by reference to existing townscape character?
Well, I think it's consistent with existing townscape character. I think really the tall buildings set adjacent to low to medium sort of rise buildings. I think certainly in terms of the character of the town, it would sit comfortably with the character of the town. I think what I would also say, just in so that's the sort of existing sort of character, and also clearly responding to sort of waymarking and legibility. I think in good and design terms, the site can comfortably accommodate, I think, sort of certainly height, and I would say that the site itself sits, occupies an important location. It sits, as part of that sort of east-west axis, or on that east-west axis. It's also central to these north-south links from both stations, Rail Station and Wood Station. It is surrounded by, we've got the town square, St Martin's Square, Market Square, all sit around it. All would benefit from some additional sort of definition and enclosure. And clearly, it is close to both the train and the bus stations. And I suppose finally, just I think the height works very well in terms of marking that civic western end of the town centre, and just again probably back to Brook House, but it balances well with Brook House and East Square.
Thank you very much. And finally, point appears to be suggested by the council. Will you have taller buildings on the periphery, as well as Brook House that's in the centre of the retail part of the town centre? Now, it's a question of sort of urban design up into the centre of the town centre. What view do you take about that as a matter of approach and the provision of tall buildings within the very centre of a town centre?
Well, I think that would be the approach you would expect in terms of urban design practice. I mean, that is what you would normally expect in terms of sort of transition of height, or change of height, is that you would sort of step up towards the central part, or the key spaces within a town centre. I think that's, again, I don't think we need to necessarily turn it up, but I think that's probably demonstrated on certainly I think it was the cross sections that were in the draft master plan. So I think it was core document B5, the master plan, and I think just as a reference, my head is on sort of page 22. I think that would check that it's 22. Yes, page 22. I think that would generally shows you good urban design practice in terms of how heights do change through a sort of town, or even through a town centre. And I'm not aware that, I'm not aware of, not familiar with any other towns where there's really sort of alternative design approaches to that, where you might sort of step down or stay the same.
Thank you very much. Thank you, sir. That's the Chief.
Thank you very much. I think that takes us precisely to the mid-morning break, 11:15. So we'll adjourn until 11:45, please. Thank you. The inquiry's resumed. Just need Mr. Jackson and then we can continue. And Mr. Jackson is there. Thank you. Mr. Edwards then, please.
Thank you. Thank you, sir. Good morning, Mr. Jackson.
Good morning, Mr. Edwards.
Thank you. Mr. Jackson, two preliminary points. Firstly, I hope a list of documents that I suggested you have available for the purposes of cross-examination has made its way to you. Has it?
It has, yes, thank you.
Can I just add one other document to that list, which arises from some points you raised in examination in chief, and that is Mr. Cafferty's presentation that was provided
Yes.
at the beginning of last week. You referred to it in your evidence in chief, so you'll be familiar with it. So we'll come to just one point on that in due course. Secondly, Mr. Jackson, as I foreshadowed when the inspector reopened the inquiry today, I'm not going to go over matters that I discussed with Mr. Cafferty last week. Plainly, there is a divergence of view between the appellant and the council relating to certain matters concerning impact on townscape. I'm not going to cross-examine your evidence on those matters. I've dealt with it through Mr. Cafferty, but that plainly is not to be taken as an indication that your evidence is accepted by the council. So hopefully we can move forward on that understanding. Mr. Jackson, there are four topics I'd like your help with, please. The first is your involvement in the appeal scheme. The second is impact on St. Martin's Square. Thirdly, impact on Brook House as part of and a component of the townscape. And fourthly, one other matter of clarification arising from the images produced in the environmental statements. So we'll run through the points in that order, if we may, beginning, and I hope briefly, with the first of those matters, your involvement. You inform the inquiry in your written proof of evidence that your firm was instructed to produce the TVIA, which formed a component of the environmental statement. And that's right, Mr. Jackson, isn't it?
That's correct.
Were you personally involved in that process?
I wasn't personally involved in the production of the townscape and visual impact assessment.
Very much indeed. Secondly, when did you become first personally involved in the appeal scheme?
Well, first personally involved, I mean, I did, although I wasn't involved in producing the townscape visual impact assessment, I did visit the site at the end of 2020, but only to assist with some photography and viewpoints at that stage. And then I essentially became involved once the scheme went to appeal.
That's very clear. Thank you, Mr. Jackson. And therefore it follows from that, but I'd be grateful for your confirmation that you were not involved in the process of what's been described as optioneering that led to the scheme that was subsequently submitted for planning approval to the council.
I was not, sir.
Thank you. And therefore the evidence that you give in your proof, and we don't need to turn it up, but it lies between paragraph 6.44 and 6.49, where you give some evidence in terms of the assessment that was carried out of townscape character and other matters during the process of generation. That is not a process, therefore, that you were involved in.
It was not a process that I was personally involved with. Having said that, I mean, I've clearly liaised with the SWOT team in terms of the preparation of my evidence, and also with my business, my practice sort of team in terms of their involvement through the process. So I'm aware of the sort of, I suppose, the approach that has been adopted.
Thank you. And a perfectly fair answer, Mr. Jackson, but the inspector can take it from that. It's that so far as the evidence that you give in respect of those matters, i.e. what assessment and understanding was derived in terms of existing townscape during the pre-application evolution of that scheme, that is, if I can put it this way, second-hand, isn't it?
Well, I've reviewed what was done in the process that went through, but I wasn't involved at that time.
Thank you. Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Jackson. Can we move to the second topic then, please, which is impact of the proposal in respect of St. Martin's Square. And as a starting point, please, can we take out your proof of evidence and turn to paragraph 6.38? And paragraph 6.38, you inform the inspector that the visual presence of the proposed development in these close views, and you're describing there a series of close views broadly from within or close to the town centre, will be considerably greater than the existing building block. And within these closer views, the design, detailing, and choice of materials will enforce the positive contribution. And obviously, there's a difference between us about positive contribution, Mr. Jackson, but your evidence, I take it, remains as set out in paragraph 6.38, that the visual presence of the development in the views that you're describing will be, your words, considerably greater than the existing development.
It will in the way I've described it there, but I'll just clarify that by saying that it's not just the, I think you refer to sort of town centre views. I mean, it's close views to the site itself. So these are, you're talking about the immediate surrounds to the site and the building.
Yeah, and that's what you're talking about, at least in part, in that description about the visual presence being considerably greater, is it? That is closer views of the building within its immediate town centre.
Yes, where you're positioned close to the building and the sort of immediate surrounds, it will have a greater visual presence than the existing building.
And that, sorry, I cut across you, Mr. Jackson.
No, that was it. Sorry, I was just explaining.
And that includes, I take it, Mr. Jackson, views from within St. Martin's Square, does it?
It will. I mean, particularly in terms of the visual presence, the greater the presence, or greater the proximity to the building. It might be from part of St. Martin's Square. There'll be places within St. Martin's Square where there'll be probably where you're alongside the Westgate Centre. You might not necessarily see that much of the building at that point, where you're sort of set further west within St. Martin's Square. So it will vary, but it will certainly be greater where you're close to the site. Yeah,
we'll come to St. Martin's Square directly, Mr. Jackson, in terms of the evidence that you give about that impact. And it goes, I think, without saying, Mr. Jackson, but lest there be any doubt about it, that considerably greater visual presence will obviously be a product of matters including the form, height, and scale of the development, won't it? Because that's what gives rise to the visual presence.
Yes, it will.
Thank you. Good. Thank you. Can we, with that thought in mind, please just look at the information that the appellant puts before the inquiry in terms of impact of the proposed development as perceived from St. Martin's Square. And just before we do that, Mr. Jackson, I take it that there would be, or there is no dispute between the appellant and the council that views from the public realm in St. Martin's Square towards and of the proposed development are important views for the inspector to consider, aren't they?
I think they are, yes, I'd agree with that.
Thank you. And in your evidence, and indeed in wider evidence produced by the appellant, or for the appellant, St. Martin's Square is identified as being essentially the civic component of Basildon Town Centre, and the square itself and the experience of those within the square itself will be relevant to that status.
So I think that's fine. That's fair, and I think what I would say, views from within any of the sort of spaces that are close to the site or surrounding the site, in terms of Market Square, Town Square, and St. Martin's Market and Town Square will all be important considerations for the inspector.
Mr. Jackson, I've just put myself on mute because the postman has just arrived, which causes a great deal of excitement with my dog. So that's not going to just go, but if it does, I'm going to just ask to take a moment and put them somewhere else. So.
I momentarily moved to mute because I was thinking it was my dog, actually.
It's a regular daily occurrence. All right, Mr. Jackson, can we just then turn to the images, please, that give an impression of the proposed development from St. Martin's Square and that impact that you've described. Could I invite you, please, to turn to the environmental statement part 1, which is CD 13. And these are the images you've described in your evidence in chief.
So the environmental statement figures.
Yep. So it's the back of CDC 13.
All right, the very last one.
Actually, I'm going to. So would you just excuse me? I'm just going to go.
Well, certainly.
Remove these dogs. That's all right.
Everyone has that. I'll get rid of the postman.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, Mr. Jackson, for giving me
You're
that.
welcome.
Do you have CD C13 available?
I do.
Thank you. Can we just pick up one or two images in CD C13? Can I just invite you, please, to go to the very last page of the document first, which is PDF page 370.
Yes, I've got that.
And that is an image taken from within St Martin's Square. It's viewpoint 22. Just to be clear, Mr. Jackson, we think that the photographer in that image is standing pretty much adjacent to the bell tower on its southern side. Is that right?
I think that sounds about right. Yes. Yep.
And this is an image that doesn't have the benefit of any sort of CGI or impression of the proposed development superimposed upon it, does it? But it shows the broad parameters of the development site as perceived from that location. Thank you very much indeed. Good, thank you. Can we then, with that image in mind, please, turn forward in the document to image 12 or view 12. Which is on, to help you, it's on page 342 in the PDF version.
Viewpoint 12, I've got existing figure 730.
Absolutely. So figure 730 is the existing view. We'll come to where this view is taken from in a moment. And then figure 731 on the next page shows that view with the proposed development superimposed upon it.
Yes.
Good. So just orientating ourselves first, we can see generally where the view existing and proposed is taken from, and it's on the north side of the ring road, which in that location I think is called Broadmain, isn't it?
Yes, that's right. Yep.
It's looking south towards the core of the town centre, and we're all familiar with it. We can see the north elevation of the church. In the centre of the image, on the right-hand side, is the north elevation of the council offices, and the gap between it leads towards St Martin's Square with the appeal site beyond, doesn't it?
That's correct.
And then I think this is actually the only verified image that shows the appeal site in relation to St Martin's Square when it's observed from looking southwards, isn't it? I don't think there's any other image that we have.
There isn't any other image in the environmental statement. I mean, the only other image that I referred to in my examination in chief was the one included within Mr. Cafferty's presentation.
I'm going to come to that in a moment, just so we can establish what benefit that image is. You didn't refer to viewpoint 12 during the course of your evidence in proof, but if we look at figure 7.31, please, which is on PDF page 343.
Yes.
We can see the centre and eastern blocks of the proposed development rising above the church. The western block, which is the tallest block, is slightly obscured in this view, isn't it? Because the tree in full foliage to the north of the council offices is in front of it.
That's correct.
But I think it's fair to say, Mr. Jackson, that if you step slightly to the east or to the left in this view, albeit looking across the ring road, then the 17-storey block within the appeal proposal will become fully in view, won't it?
I think that's fair. I mean, again, part of the bottom part of the building may be obscured by the church, but essentially, yes, you'd certainly read the upper part of the 17 stories.
And I mean, albeit this view is taken from outside St Martin's Square and to the north of it, it is perhaps, Mr. Jackson, and I'd invite you to agree, a useful view in showing the relationship of the proposed development, and in particular, the 17-storey element of the proposed development on St Martin's View, because one can, I think, gain an impression from looking at the proposed development from the position of viewpoint 13, what the impact of that proposed development would be within St Martin's Square. Would you agree?
No, I don't fully agree. I mean, I think, well, firstly, you can't really see the that element, that 17-story element from this view. Yes, I accept that if you move slightly further to the left, you'll see it. I think the other thing you don't really get an impression from, certainly from this point of view, in relation to St Martin's Square, is almost the size of the square. I mean, you're going to be looking through a fairly narrow aspect across the square. You'll have the bell tower probably visible. So I don't think it's going to give you, an understanding of fully how the 17-story block sort of relates to the size and scale of the St Martin's Square.
No, Mr. Jackson, we'll come on to the position within St Martin's Square and what evidence is before the inspector to assist with that judgment in a moment. But what perhaps this image does give an impression of is the relationship of the proposed 17-story element of the appeal scheme by reference to the church and the council offices, doesn't it, which form two existing components enclosing St Martin's Square?
Well, I mean, I think, again, this image you can certainly see the church, and in part you can see the council house offices, but looking at this image, the council house offices are largely obscured by the trees. Looking at, again, the positioning, probably the top part of the council house offices are not that far, not that dissimilar to the highest parts of the 17-story unit, just in terms of what I can see through the trees. And I think it gives you a fair understanding, certainly how the development will sit within the, I suppose, the slightly wider townscape that does stretch down towards Brook House and Great Oaks House, because you can quite clearly see both of those on the left of the photograph, and also the additional stories that went on top of Northgate House. So I think as a composition showing various different elements, certainly within probably the east and probably principally the western part of the town centre, I think it's a fair representation, certainly in terms of gaining an understanding of how the scheme will sit in that context.
But beyond, Mr. Jackson, thank you, beyond figure 731, viewpoint 12, there's been no sort of verified visualization, has there, provided by the appellant showing the relationship of the appeal scheme to a receptor in St Martin's Square, i.e. showing how it would be perceived within St Martin's Square?
There hasn't been a sort of a verified visualization from within St Martin's Square. And again, I'd take you back to probably where I started, just in terms of the approach that we adopted for the study. Close liaison and consultation with the council. I mean, there was discussion firstly over the location of the viewpoints, and then secondly over which ones we should produce visualizations for and the nature of those visualizations. So, I mean, there's been, certainly opportunity for the council, if they'd felt that one was necessary from within St Martin's Square, for that to be carried out.
Yeah, Mr. Jackson, there's no dispute as a matter of fact, these viewpoints haven't been agreed by officers with the council at pre-application stage, but the view wasn't taken by the appellant to produce any image from St Martin's Square once the planning permission had been refused, had it?
Well, we obviously haven't produced one from within St Martin's Square. There isn't certainly a verified visualization that we've produced. Like I say, there's the CGI one within Capity's presentation, but that's not certainly one we've produced.
Thank you. And then, so far as the image within Mr. Capity's presentation is concerned, you have that available, please. It's the second page of that presentation that shows an impression of the proposed development from just within St Martin's Square, with the church on the left and the bell tower. Do you have that available?
Yes, I've got that.
I just want to be clear as to what weight the inspector should attach to this. It's described in the bottom left-hand corner as an artist's impression. You see that? I take it from Mr. Jackson that this is not what could be described as being a verified view, is it? It's just an impression of what the building would look like.
That's correct. That's certainly my understanding.
Yeah, I mean, the reason we say that, I ask you that question, is that Mr. Lowndes and others on behalf of the council are concerned about whether what is shown in this artist's impression does actually correctly show the relationship of the proposed development, including and in particular the 17-story element of the proposed development, to existing features in and around St Martin's Square. But I take it from your answer that it's not intended to be an impression that descends to that level of accuracy, does it?
I don't think it goes to that level of accuracy, but I think it's certainly as an impression. I would certainly, the way I've looked at it and also compared it with like you say, that even the viewpoint that you refer to, viewpoint 12, again, I think if you look at that and the proportion, the relationship between the height of the church to the height of the 17 stories, my take would be that even as an artist's impression, that is a fair depiction for, certainly in terms of its presence within the view. I would have thought that is very fair, and certainly I think the inspector could reasonably rely upon that as an artist's impression, as a fair depiction of it.
Well, I understand its status as the inspector will have to form a view on that matter, no doubt, having regard to what's observed on the further site visit. All right, can we just then look at things more generally with regard to St Martin's Square and the role of the appeal proposal within it? I put to Mr Cafferty last week, and he readily agreed that there was nothing within the original concept for Basildon Town Centre, or indeed subsequently, that reveals that a building of the scale and particularly the height proposed was ever envisaged to be introduced on the appeal site. I take it you don't refer to any evidence to contradict that, nor do you take a different view, Mr Jackson, do you?
No, I don't know.
Thank you very much indeed. In terms of overall urban design objectives for St Martin's Square, please, could we turn to CDB4, which is the 2012 SPD, Master Plan SPD?
Yes, I've got that.
And thank you. Would you turn within it, please, to internal page or printed page 21? Do you have that, Mr. Jackson?
I do.
Good. Thank you very much indeed. No doubt you're familiar with this document, Mr. Jackson. You refer to it in your evidence. And on page 21, you'll see a section of the document that's headed St Martin's Square. And in paragraph 637 that follows that heading, we see that it provides a vision for St Martin's Square, which is to create a lively mixed-use area, which retains an emphasis on civic, church, theatre and arts uses. Do you see that?
I do.
And then it sets out below that development opportunities. And then by reference to the plan, particularly the drawing, which is the lower of the two drawings on page 21 and the key, we can see those development opportunities then identified, can't we?
Yes, we can, yep.
And some of those development opportunities have already been addressed since this document was adopted, and those include the relocation of the market. You can see that at point 2 in the key, and also some hard landscaping improvements or enhancements to St Martin's Square, which is identified as 3, can't we?
Yes.
And Mr. Jackson, beyond that, there's nothing, is there, in this vision for St Martin's Square that envisages the introduction of a building of 17 stories on the appeal site as part of that vision, or what would be required to fulfill it?
I mean, there isn't within this document. I can clearly see that.
Yeah, and if we turn on, please, for completeness, there's some further guidance given in this document with regard to St Martin's Square as an urban place and the vision for it, in a section that begins on internal page 33. Turn to that. Actually, it begins on page 32 and then extends through to page 4. Again, this addresses St Martin's Square and sets out in perhaps a little bit more detail, particularly in paragraph 658 on page 33, the key objectives for the square. You see that, Mr. Jackson? Again, you'll be familiar with it, and same question, I expect the same answer. There's nothing within the key objectives for St Martin's Square set out in this document that envisage a building of the scale and height proposed on the appeal site as being what is sought to be achieved in terms of St Martin's Square as a place within the public realm, isn't there?
There isn't here. I mean, just looking at the key objectives, they seem to be focused almost entirely upon, I suppose, sort of landscape, environmental improvements and public realm without any obvious reference from what I can see to any sort of new.
No. Well, Mr. Jackson, before we look at one or two other references in this document, I don't detect that you take any point of criticism with regard to the vision or the objectives for St Martin's Square that are set out in this document or sought to be achieved.
I mean, I think the only thing I would say is that clearly this was, in 2012, clearly in a sort of different time and sort of context, and things have moved on. Clearly, there have been studies undertaken subsequently that have supported a master plan and a regeneration strategy that are showing a different approach.
Oh, Mr. Jackson, yes, I understand your reliance on those documents. We'll come to that if we need to in due course. But as far as St Martin's Square is concerned, as a place within the public realm of Basildon, the function of St Martin's Square hasn't changed, has it, since 2012, when this document was prepared and adopted?
Yeah, I don't think that the function of the place has changed now.
No, thank you very much. Can we then just go on, please, to within the document to paragraph 6423? You deal with this, I hope.
Sorry, 6423.
That's my note. Let me just check that reference. I think that's right. Yeah, 6423 on internal page 28. And we can take this briefly because this is a point that I put to Mr. Cafferty last week. Just remind yourself of the text on within the first column of the text under the subheading tall buildings or taller buildings.
Yes, yeah, 6423, yeah.
Absolutely. We can see that there's a reference within 6423 to taller buildings in various locations north of Station Square and the Transit Mall along Fodderwick would benefit from legibility of the town centre if placed strategically at key arrival points. Now, plainly that does lend some support. I accept, Mr. Jackson, to the issue about introducing legibility in locations including the appeal site. But no doubt you would accept that if we look at the very next page of this document, that as far as what is envisaged within at least part of the appeal site is concerned, what it's providing in terms of illustrative heights is a 2 to 4 story development, isn't it?
Well, I accept that on the plan it shows the sort of western side of the sort of appeal scheme site as a 2 to 4 stories, but it doesn't seem to, the plan doesn't seem to match what it says at 6.4.23. I mean, I think that where it does clearly refer to all the buildings north of Station Square, Transit Mall and along Fodderwick would benefit from that. So all I was pointing out was that I can see what the plan says, and that shows the western end of the site again at this stage showing 2 to 4 stories, but I don't think that correlates with the paragraph 423.
There we are. I'll make submissions on the document in due course, but as a general proposition, Mr. Jackson, no doubt you would accept that in order to achieve legibility, to provide a wayfinding function from the station along Fodderwick towards St Martin's Square, it is not necessary to introduce a building of 17 stories, is it? And that function, that objective, can be met with a building of lesser height.
I think in terms of not necessary, yes, that's correct. But I think in terms of certainly the position and the importance, as I see it, of that location, and particularly the northwest corner of the site and its relationship to the east-west axis and St Martin's Square, I think yes, it could be. It needn't be 17 stories, but I think given its sort of importance, given the role that it will also play in terms of added definition and enclosure to St Martin's Square, you might say, oh well, there's not going to be a great deal of difference with 16 stories. I think if you go down too far, though, I think it's a different matter.
And it follows from that, I think, Mr. Jackson, that it's common ground between us that if the inspector forms the view in accordance with the council's case that the development does cause harm to the townscape, it follows from your answer that reflects Mr. Cafferty's answer last week, that if the objective of wayfinding matters, legibility matters of that type need to be met, that doesn't then require a building of 17 stories to be accepted, notwithstanding that harm.
Sorry, could you just repeat the question? I'm sorry.
Yeah, it was a badly put question. Let me do it again. If the inspector forms the view that the development does cause harm, then the inspector does not need to accept that level of harm if, in order to achieve the legibility and wayfaring function that development on the appeal site is expected to accept, because you accept that it is not necessary for a building of 17 stories to be introduced to meet that objective.
I think clearly it's a matter for the inspector to sort of judge that level of harm and how he considers that in relation to the sort of, I suppose, the height of the scheme. And I think, again, I would say that, I think it's in terms of the legibility and wayfinding, that's one aspect of looking at the height. I think, again, as I said, in terms of the relationship to St Martin's Square and the added sort of enclosure and definition, particularly that key corner, I think, there are other elements of the 17-story sort of height that quite clearly the inspector has got to consider, of which obviously legibility and wayfinding is one. And if the inspector considers that a lower height could perform the same job and factors in all of the other matters that need to be taken into account with the height, and comes to a judgment that the harm on all fronts would be less with a lower height, then I mean, again, that's for him to make that judgment.
Thank you very much indeed, helpful, Mr. Jackson. Thank you. And then, so far as the other functions that you consider need to be achieved so far as St Martin's Square is concerned, which are enclosure, and one might add to that sort of activation in terms of frontage onto St Martin's Square with modern usable floor space. Again, I take it is common ground between us, Mr. Jackson, that a building of 17 stories is not required to be introduced on the appeal site in order to perform those functions in terms of St Martin's Square, is it?
Well, I think certainly in terms of the sort of enclosure and definition, I think certainly 17 stories fits appropriately with the size and the scale of the space of St Martin's Square. So I think, again, you could argue over whether it's 18, whether it's 16, but I think a building of that order in terms of height is entirely appropriate in terms of the enclosure and definition point in relation to St Martin's Square. In terms of sort of activation and the, bringing that corner of St Martin's Square to life through with a improved retail offer, then yes, no, the height doesn't need to be.
Thank you very much, Lee. Can I just then explore a little more the first answer that you gave with regard to enclosure? I mean, as I understand the case that's being advanced by the appellant, Mr. Jackson, through you and others, is that essentially there needs to be effectively some consolidation of development on what is the southeastern corner of St Martin's Square. I mean, it seems if that is an objective, that is one that needs to be achieved or is positive, then I simply don't understand why you say that in order to achieve that degree of enclosure, a building of 17 stories, which is an order of magnitude higher than any existing development surrounding St Martin's Square, is either necessary or appropriate.
I think the way I see it, that is a corner key aspect of St Martin's Square. Clearly, sort of probably any sort of increase in height would improve the current situation. Again, I think if you look back at that viewpoint within the environmental statement, the corner of the square has very little presence, and you have very little understanding of those important links through to Town Square and along the way towards the train station. So I think, so I just think that, yeah, I mean, obviously any increase would help the definition. I think in terms of the St Martin's Square and that key nodal point, 17 stories is.
Sorry, I lost you then, Mr. Jackson. Maybe there's seems to be some movement of paper going on. Could you just repeat the last part of your answer, please?
Yeah, I suppose I'm saying that the 17 stories, just in terms of the nature and scale of Martin's Square, and the fact that there's a key nodal or key sort of corner with relationship to Fodder and the access to the train station and also to Town Square. That's why it sort of warrants that increased height.
Just wondering whether Denton's team has its microphone on. I'm assuming Mr. Jackson.
Can you hear me, sir?
Yes.
Hello?
I'm not sure, Mr. Jackson. I don't know whether your microphone is Denton's team. Presumably it is. Sorry, I'm just looking at microphones that are open. Well, we've only got 3, so we're all right. But yes, there was some rustling of papers, which was causing, or certainly a distraction, if not an interruption. Did you get the answer, Mr. Edwards?
I did, sir. Yes, I got sufficient note of the answer. Thank you very much.
Thank
indeed.
you.
Thank you. Mr. Jackson, can we just move on to 1 or 2 other points of reference in terms of published guidance with regard to St. Martin's Square as a element of the public realm? We've looked at B4 together. Can we look at B7, please? CDD7, which is the "we made that" urban appraisal.
Yes, I've got that.
And can we turn within it to internal page or printed page 66? Do you have that open, Mr. Jackson?
Oh, yes, Scott.
Indeed. And we can see that on page 66, there's some description of St. Martin's Square. We can see the image there, which is located within the square, looking broadly northeast to the church and the shopping centre on the right-hand side. And we can see some text along the left-hand side. Just familiarise yourself again with the text, Mr. Jackson. Let me reading it out.
Yes.
And again, it's a short point, Mr. Jackson, but nothing on this page of the urban appraisal that suggests that there is any deficiency in St. Martin's Square as a result of existing development on the appeal site, or in particular, that the introduction of a building of the scale proposed to this appeal proposal is necessary or indeed identified as being appropriate within St. Martin's Square.
I accept that there's nothing on that page, but I think, as I sort of covered in chief, in terms of the connections and links through to St. Martin's Square, which is where the appeal scheme sits, there's clearly some benefits that would have derived from the scheme in relation to those key links and routes into St. Martin's Square.
Thank you very much indeed. You're familiar with this document generally, Mr. Jackson, I take it. Are you? Document B7?
Yes.
Absolutely. Again, perhaps we can agree between us that there's nothing in this document at all that suggests anywhere that a building of the scale proposed upon the appeal site is necessary or indeed appropriate so far as providing any enhancement to St. Martin's Square is concerned.
I'm not sure. I'm not aware of anything within the document that was categorically specifically state that.
Thank you. You can put that document to one side then, please. Can I then turn to issue 3, which is Brook House? I'd just like your help with your position in terms of the current function of Brook House within the existing townscape. So could we turn, please, with that point in mind, to your proof of evidence at paragraph 6.60. You have that? It's at the bottom of 34. Can we just look together what you say in 6.60? It's under the heading, Brook House has an important singularity in its role in townscape legibility in the town centre. And just for wider context, this I think is part of your evidence, Mr. Jackson, isn't it, where you're seeking to address the particular points raised by the council and its reason for refusal in its statement of case.
It is, yeah, and obviously at that stage, the singularity of Brook House was one of those issues that the council was pursuing. But again, as I said in chief, I understand now from Mr. Lowndes' evidence that that's not the case.
Well, I'm not sure that's quite right, Mr. Jackson. I mean, what Mr. Lowndes made clear is that there's no evidence one way or the other as far as he sees it in terms of whether Brook House was intended to be a single tall building within a townscape. And then he went on, as you no doubt recognise from his evidence, to look at the contribution that Brook House makes to the townscape now.
Yeah, I mean, I understood from his evidence that the singularity wasn't a point of singularity that he was pursuing. It was the concern was sort of any domineering or dominance over Brookhouse.
Yeah,
but if I'm wrong about that, then that's fine.
The inspector has a note of the evidence, landscape. I'll have to pick that up with other witnesses in due course. Anyway, let's look at what you have to say about Brookhouse in paragraph 6.60, please. Brookhouse is a landmark building within the town centre, and it has undoubtedly played a role in the legibility of the townscape since it was originally constructed. Then you refer to heritage value. And then in 6.61, in townscape terms, Brookhouse remains a local landmark and a recognisable building within the town centre, particularly in terms of its more immediate role and influence within the central part of the town centre around East Square and Town Square. You see that? Yeah. So just so I'm clear as to the observation that you are making in that part of your written evidence, Mr. Jackson, firstly, you accept that Brookhouse is, your words, a landmark building within the town centre.
Yes.
Thank you. Secondly, in townscape terms, your assessment is it remains a landmark, local landmark, and a recognised building within the town centre, particularly in terms of its role in relation to East Square and Town Square.
Yes.
Good, thank you. And then you go on in paragraph 6.61, after the section that I've just read, you say that it contributes to the legibility, identification, and visual presence of the town scale. However, its role and influence in these latter terms has lessened over time as relatively other tall buildings have been built within and around the town centre. Whilst Brookhouse remains the tallest, it is generally seen within longer range and wider views alongside those other tall buildings. Do you see that?
Yes.
And then so far as those other tall buildings that you're referring to there, those are Brookhouse, the Icon, Trafford, Kettling and Cherry Down. Is that right? See those referred to there?
Yes, certainly those are the ones that are referenced there, but clearly just in terms of longer range and wider views, then depending on where you are and which viewpoint it is, other taller buildings are also visible.
Thank you very much, Lee. And those other taller buildings that you are referring to in paragraph 6.61, just to be clear, if we turn forward in your proof of evidence to paragraph 6.55 at the bottom of page 23.
Sorry, 655.
Yeah, 6.55, bottom of page 23. Those are buildings, aren't they, that you describe in that paragraph of your evidence as within the peripheral or transitional areas of the town centre?
Sorry, all the ones you just cited?
Well, they're the ones that you were referring to there, I think, aren't they? Which are Great Oaks House.
Well, yeah, I would, yeah, but I don't think that's directly linked. I wouldn't refer to Great Oaks House as within a peripheral transitional area. I think Great Oaks House, which sits, like I say, pretty close to Brookhouse, you wouldn't describe that as being or I am pretty sure I haven't described that as being in a peripheral or transitional area.
All right. Sorry, forgive me, I interrupted you.
I was going to say, in terms of the other buildings listed there, I mean, the Icon and the Trafford House do sit, you know, sort of close to the station, and I think just in terms of the town centre, you know, you could describe they are on the sort of periphery or edge of the town centre. Similarly, Cherry Down, but again, Kelting House, I don't think I've described that anywhere as being in a peripheral location.
All right, well, the inspector can form his own view as to those matters, but just lest there be any doubt about your evidence, Mr. Jackson, paragraph 6.55.
Yes.
You say that in relation to existing building heights within the wider townscape, it's relevant to note not only the height of Brookhouse, but also the height of other existing buildings generally sited beyond the town centre core within the peripheral and peripheral stroke transitional areas. These include a series of existing 9 to 11 stories high, and the recently approved GS8 scheme for another peripheral town centre location is for 11 stories along Broadway. You see that?
Yes.
I mean, I had certainly understood that you were referring there, when you referred to 9 to 11 story high buildings, essentially those buildings that you've described later in your evidence and also in your evidence in chief, including buildings such as Great Oaks House and other existing buildings. Because they are the 9 to 11 story
So,
buildings.
no, they're what, sorry?
They are the 9 to 11 story buildings, aren't they?
They're also 9 to 11, but I wouldn't have put them in the peripheral area bracket. But I mean, particularly, I've certainly of Great Oaks House and Kelting House. I mean, certainly neither of them. Kelting House does sit towards close to the sort of, I suppose, the ring road to the southeast. But I'd still have that sort of within the core as opposed to being on the periphery. And Great Oaks House, certainly within that main town centre area.
So just so your evidence, if I can make a note of it and make for reference in due course, that you think that Ketling House and Great Oaks House are, as you say it, within the core of the town centre, do you?
Yes, I mean, again, there's always a it doesn't go suddenly core and then periphery. There's not a black and white line, but I wouldn't place them in the periphery category. In terms of if you're talking about proximity to that east-west axis, then they're not on that east-west axis, but they're not peripheral.
Thank you very much indeed. Good. Thank you. Well, the inspector can form his own view on that, and I'll make submissions on that in due course. I think then finally on this topic, please, can we just go back or go to actually core document B6, which is the document you refer to in your evidence in chief, and that's the 2015 Urban Characterisation and Design Review, core document B6.
Yes, I've got that.
Thank you very much indeed. Can we turn, please, within that document to page 133, 133. And tell me when you have that, Mr. Jackson.
That's it.
And it's in a section of the document that begins 2 pages earlier under the heading Recommendations. Okay. And if we look at page 133, you'll see the subheading Legibility. We can look at the second bullet point under that subheading, where the review says this: existing landmarks, vistas and views along corridors and orientation points should be recognised and protected. And opportunities should be maximised to create new landmark buildings, memorable and distinctive images and key strategic breaks in the frontage. Now, so far as the first element of that recommendation is concerned, existing landmarks, vistas and views along corridors should be recognised and protected. No doubt, Mr. Jackson, you would accept that an existing landmark feature within Basildon Town Centre is Brook House, isn't it? Indeed, you say that in your evidence.
Yes, I accept that it's an existing landmark, yes.
Very much indeed. Thank you. Good. And that, therefore, in accordance with these recommendations, is a landmark that is recommended to be recognised and protected.
Yes, existing landmarks, this views on personal information. Yes, I mean that's what the recommendation is here.
Very much indeed. And that is no doubt a recommendation insofar as it reflects, an urban design objective for Basildon Town Centre is one that you would support.
Well, I would expect it to go through sort of due sort of process and ultimately to be recognised or identified as a a landmark or a vista or a view along corridors. They need to be sort of, I think, recognised in due course or in some sort of policy terms, of which I'm not aware there is anything. But I think as a premise, I know.
Thank you very much. Good. And then please, in the same document, could you turn forward to page 125? Just tell me when you have that.
Yes.
And this is part of page 125 is part of the document that begins on page 121, and it's the Urban Design Review SWOT Analysis.
Sorry,
125?
125, yes, in this document.
It's part of the SWOT analysis.
Yes, and it's got legibility and adaptability on there.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Yep, got the right one.
Thank you. And so far as the columns in the table on page 125 is concerned, as it's made clear 2 pages before, it's a SWOT analysis, and the columns in terms of the second to fourth columns are strength S, W, weakness, then thirdly, opportunity, and then fourthly, threat.
Yes.
Yeah,
Yes.
absolutely. And if we just look, please, on page 125 at this analysis under in the context of legibility, we can see that in the weakness column, which is the third column along, the second substantive column, lack of significant landmark buildings, statement architecture or works of art, especially at key gateways, providing focal points in an area. You see?
Yes. Yes.
That's a weakness. And then if we look then at threats, which is the last column, inappropriate and out of scale building form that impacts on views, skyline and roofscape. Do you see?
Yes.
And no doubt, Mr. Jackson, you would accept that in an analysis of this type, it's necessary to actually look at the analysis as a whole, the weakness, the opportunities and the threats together.
Yes. Yep.
Absolutely. And albeit that the document is recognizing a lack of significant landmark buildings at gateways and focal points, that's something that the document would indicate as a weakness, it should be addressed. It is important for the inspector to bear in mind that in terms of the response envisaged in this document, inappropriate and out of scale built form is a threat and would be harmful, wouldn't it?
And I think that's clearly something that the inspector will consider. But I think we've shown and demonstrated, certainly in terms of the evidence provided by Mr. Cafferty on the design, it's certainly not inappropriate and out of scale.
Well, there's a judgment to be made by Mr. Jackson. That's an issue between us. But I think what perhaps does follow from this element of the analysis in the urban characterization and design review is that, yes, landmark buildings or the absence of them at key focal points is a weakness. But what is certainly not envisaged by way of a response are buildings that are inappropriate or out of scale. And the document is expressly cautioning against that response, isn't it, Mr. Jackson?
Yes, I think that's fair.
Thank you. Good. Thank you. Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Jackson. Then just one final point then, please, under my last heading of sort of other issues. And it's really a point of clarification and confirmation. Can we go back, please, to core document C13, which is part 1 of the environmental statement, and turn within it to view 20, or viewpoint 20. And if it helps, it begins.
I've got it.
It's page 364 for the existing view.
Yes, viewpoint 20. I've got
it follows the same format. We've got the existing view at figure 7.52, and then thereafter following the view with the appeal scheme in place, and then a cumulative assessment.
Yes.
Of all those. So it's just a point of clarification. You gave some evidence in chief concerning the view from the station, in particular station users, and you referred to the image within this sequence of images that shows the view from the, I think it's the south platform, the southern platform on the station. Do you remember referring to that?
I do, yes, yes.
And then you said, well, also of relevance is the impact of the proposed development from the station forecourt. And you sort of describe that. We don't have an image from the station forecourt, but what we do have is image viewpoint 20, don't we? Which, albeit is not from the station forecourt, is from a position on the traffic island to the south of Fodderwick, which is broadly on one of the routes that could be taken from the station into the town centre, isn't it?
Yes.
Really. And just so I'm clear, in terms of what is shown in the image with the appeal scheme in place, which is figure 7.53, that's a cropped image, isn't it? In fact, it doesn't show the full height of the building for that location.
Correct.
Really. And I think by my calculation, it shows about 10 or 11 stories. So in terms of the tallest element of the building within the appeal scheme on the northwest corner. So obviously what's cropped is the top 6 or 7 stories off this building, isn't it?
Yeah, top 6 stories, I can just count to the 11, so yes, yes.
And then in terms of what the inspector can usefully draw from this image, cropped as it is is that this is perhaps some impression, isn't it? It's subject to the cropping that we've discussed of the experience of a person walking from the station towards the town centre along Fodderwick.
I mean, I think it probably it will assist the inspector in terms of that that route along Fodderwick into St Martin's Square. I mean, clearly there's no, there's no other measures that may well come forward as part of any wider regeneration in terms of the public realm proposals within this. But I'm aware that our scheme hasn't got specific public realm proposals, as I understand it, for this part of Fodderwick.
Sorry, I don't quite understand that.
Sorry, I suppose the image, it shows obviously the appeal scheme in place, but in terms of any sort of wider sort of regeneration strategy, in due course, we would expect the public realm proposals to improve this arrangement of or this immediate space that you see in the foreground outside the Beehive pub.
I see. Well, is there anything that you? I don't think there's anything.
It was a. I think yes, we've got the appeal. The appeal scheme is in place here, and that's.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. As I said, Mr. Jackson, just it's just a point of clarification to understand whether this is an image that does actually provide some assistance in terms of the experience of someone travelling from the station on foot towards the town centre. And as you've confirmed, this is one of those routes. And what we see there is a building that is cropped, albeit the top 6 stories would need to be considered as part of the overall experience, wouldn't they?
Yes.
Good. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you, Mr. Jackson. Thank you. So those were all the questions I had for Mr. Jackson.
Thank you, Mr. Edwards. Mr. Liness, any matters of re-examination?
Yes, sir. Thank you very much. Just a few briefly, please. Can we go back to the start of the cross-examination, please? Mr. Jackson, when you were taken to your proof paragraph 6.38, please. Just to be accurate about the reference that was made there. You were taken to 638 on page 31, and it put to you that you'd said that the visual presence of the proposed development in these close views will be considerably greater than the existing building block. Just for clarity, if one turns back over to page 30 and one sees the heading there, viewpoints 20 to 22, could you just clarify for the inspector, please, the views in respect of which the judgment about close views and considerably greater was being expressed, please?
Yeah, I mean, in this context, it's those views that are immediately sort of surrounding the site, and I think probably with any development, be it 17 stories or or just any sort of increase upon an existing building height, I think they're going to be.
Down to 639, you expressed the view there that the effect will be moderate beneficial.
Yes.
Can you just explain why you reached that view, notwithstanding you said in 638 that there'll be considerably greater visual presence?
Yes, because although there'll be much greater visual presence and sort of marked change in the view, I think what you've got to do is you've got to compare what you'll be looking at with what's there at present. And I think in simple terms and following the guidelines, I mean, we get to a judgment of moderate beneficial because clearly the high quality architectural sort of design of the scheme, coupled with the sort of, I suppose, activation and animation that's going to bring, particularly at sort of ground floor level, in overall terms, will certainly visually create a moderate beneficial effect.
Thank you very much. And you were asked questions about views from St Martin's Square. You accepted they're important views for the inspector to consider, along with views in any of the spaces, Town Square, Market Square as well. To what extent, to your knowledge, Mr. Jackson, are any views within the town centre identified any protective policy relating to view management or otherwise?
I'm not aware that there are any sort of within the town centre, even sort of surrounding the town centre, that are protected now.
Thank you very much. Next, please. You were asked questions about views from viewpoint 12 as a means to judge impacts on views in St Martin's Square. don't need you to go back through your answer in relation to viewpoint 12, but again, do you understand any issue to be taken with the council as regards the impact of the proposal in viewpoint 12 in particular?
I don't. I mean, as far as I was concerned, from the council's perspective, they sort of hadn't got any concerns with that, and certainly the views that Mr. Lowndes had raised concern about were only those sort of within the town centre.
Thank you very much. And did the council ever ask for any viewpoint from St Martin Square in particular to be prepared?
No, like I say, we went through there was an extensive process, and there was sort of toing and froing in terms of agreeing the views, and then subsequently the visualisations and the nature of those visualisations. So, I mean, there was ample opportunity, and no, they certainly didn't request one.
Even after refusing or reporting to having putative refusal, did the council ever suggest that it was necessary to prepare a viewpoint from St Martin Square? We have a townscape and visual assessment from the appellant. Has it identified any particular reviews itself, either from St Martin Square or elsewhere in the town centre as having particular importance?
Sorry, our TVIA?
No, they're the council's TVA produced for the purposes of this appeal.
No, they haven't.
Very much. Is there anything in the townscape and visual assessment prepared for the council which identifies why views in St Martin Square in particular should be treated as unacceptable?
No, there isn't. No.
Thank you very much. You were then asked questions about the 2012 master plan. Can we just take that out, please? CDB4. And you're asked a number of questions about St Martin Square. Can we go to page 19 of that document first of all, please? The internal page 19.
Yes.
And we see there that the proposed land use plan is identified on page 19, and one sees the separate quarters identified there. Whereabouts is the appeal site identified in which quarter, Mr. Jackson?
Well, the appeal site is within Station Quarter.
Thank you very much. So if we go on to page 21, one sees St Martin Square identified there. Again, is the appeal site within St Martin Square or outside it?
It's outside.
Thank you very much. Now, I'm not going to go through points about the weight and age of this document. We've gone through before. But if we go on to page 28 of the document, please. We look at 6.4.20.
Yes.
Extending the massing profile and height in key locations will also assist the legibility of the townscape core. Key locations could include along principal town centre routes to terminate view corridor vistas on strategic town centre gateway locations. To what extent is the location of the tall building on the appeal site consistent or inconsistent with that? Please.
Well, entirely consistent as far as I'm concerned.
Thank you very much. 6422 and 6423 you were taken to as well. Town centre taller buildings. It's anticipated in the early stage of the master plan new development at the station quarter will take the form of medium to higher rise buildings. An opportunity to incorporate further similar tall buildings location could be considered. Then 6423 taller buildings north of Station Square and along Fodderwick would benefit the legibility of the town centre if placed strategically key arrival points. Again, to what extent to be consistent or inconsistent with that approach, please?
Again, entirely consistent.
And to go back to page 20, please, in a document at 6.3.2. One notes there the plan, key development sites and spaces, and the marking shown heading towards St Martin's Square. If we look at 6.3.2 on page 20, town centre is characterised by formal spaces subject to regeneration will make a positive contribution to Basildon's future success. present town centre follows a dominant west-east axis from St Martin's Square to Town Square, south-east of the covered Eastgate Centre. As a whole, the network does not at present provide a coherent retail circuit, and the town centre lacks lacks basic positive gateway spaces and connectivity to the wider community. Again, to what extent do you consider development on the appeal side to be consistent or inconsistent with this approach?
Well, again, it would be entirely consistent with what he says there.
Thank you very much. Now, you put a number of questions that went through this document and others about whether it was required to put a building of this height in this location. On a number of occasions, you referred to things sort of appropriate in this location. In your view, Mr. Jackson, when the inspector is looking at this, the approach to take, on the one hand, asking whether one requires a building of this height in this location, or whether it's appropriate and beneficial to do so, which is the correct approach in your view, and why?
Well, it's whether it's appropriate. I mean, again, it's down to, again, I think all the matters that have been discussed so far at this inquiry in terms of, you know, the character and the, I suppose, what just in I suppose urban design terms and conceptual terms, what works for that site.
Thank you. And in a similar vein, you're put a couple of questions along this line, which is that if the inspector accepts there's been harm to townscape, then there's nothing to require our points on legibility, wayfinding, and so on to be required as accepted. When you're approaching this question of harm overall, do you split townscape and on the one hand and legibility, wayfaring on the other, or do you consider both as part of an overall judgment? Which approach do you take?
I think you've got to consider both as part of an overall judgment. I think certainly townscape terms, that's what it's all about, putting all of these factors together.
Thank you very much. And when you do that overall judgment, what view do you take?
Well, we clearly take the view that the appeal scheme will provide a beneficial effect to townscape.
Now, next, you were taken to CDB7, which was the we made that master plan urban appraisal. And you're taken to page 66 of that document. Can we go there briefly, please?
Yes.
Now, looking at what this part of the document was doing, if one looks at the top of the page, it says public realm audit by area. And if we look down in the text on page 66, it refers to space integrates the church garden with the main square with seating and planting. The design also incorporates lighting columns, and then reference to the second paragraph to paving and arrangement of furniture. Do you see that?
I do, yes.
What function was this part of the document, in your view, focusing on?
Well, this is simply almost just counting up what's there and just providing a baseline position, and isn't undertaking any sort of analysis or appraisal in terms of I suppose the townscape or any requirements. It's essentially just what's there at present.
Okay, so reference there to audit, is that consistent or inconsistent with the answer you just given?
Yeah, that's consistent, yeah.
And to what extent was it the role of this part of the document to consider broader townscape matters, including enclosure height and so on?
Right. Again, it's simply an audit of it.
And if one looks back to page 46 of the document, please. I think we went here
Yes.
in your evidence in chief. When one is looking at other issues, including movement and wayfinding, what approach do you say the inspector should take when looking at the document as a whole as regards the appeal scheme?
Well, I think as a whole, I mean, again, I think this is one of the ones that is important in terms of highlighting at the moment where the key links are and matters of wayfinding. So I think this is where the inspector should focus attention.
And we know from the cover that this document was produced by We Made That. Was this the only document that they produced for the council?
Well, I know that this is this sort of supported the subsequent sort of draft master plan document.
Yes.
I'm not aware whether they were the authors of that document. But I'm aware that this underpins both the draft master plan document that then fed into the regeneration strategy. So,
thank you.
Evidence basis, obviously.
And if we take out the draft master plan that you mentioned, please, CDB 5. Go to page 7 of the document first of all, please.
Yes.
The middle column about this project.
Yeah.
Baselberg commissioned architects and urban design. We made that in real estate consultants Cushman and Wakefield develop a master plan for the future Basel Town Centre. The master plan aims to build the current asset of the town centre. Did you see that?
Yes, I do.
And if one goes on to page 22 of the document, please. Building heights. One looks down to the second paragraph. It has a prominent feature in the townscape, identified opportunity for additional tall buildings to complement this. The residential development should be lower in scale, taller market buildings, marking out routes into the town centre in the third paragraph. And just to gather another couple of references over the page 23, one sees a visual image provided there. So taking pages 22 and 23 together and building on the work that we looked at, we made that in the urban appraisal. What view do you take about the view reached by the council's independent master planners as regards scale and height on the appeal side?
Well, I think certainly the independent master planners were of the view that it could have come in height of the sort of nature that
Thank you very much. Thank you. Now, finally, please, I think, let's go to the document at CDB 6, which is the Urban Characterisation Study. And you're taken to page 133. Can we go there briefly, please? Second bullet point under legibility, existing landmarks, vistas and views along corridors and orientation points should be recognised and protected. And you've dealt with this already, but to what extent was any reference there to recognition and protection reflected in any formal policy that's been advanced by the council?
I don't think there is any. I don't think there's any sort of any policy recognition of landmarks.
Very much. And if one reads on to the second sentence, opportunities should be maximised to create new landmark buildings, memorable and distinctive images, and strategic breaks and frontages. So the reference there to opportunities should be maximised to create new landmark buildings. To what extent is the proposal consistent or inconsistent with that recommendation?
Entirely consistent.
And to what extent is that recommendation consistent or inconsistent with the maintenance of brick house as a singular tall building in the townscape of the town centre?
It clearly doesn't require Brookhouse to remain as a singular tall building. It's quite clear that it's talking about additional new landmark buildings.
Thank you very much. And did this recommendation seek to prescribe any particular scale that a new landmark should achieve?
It doesn't know.
Because we're back to page 125 of the document. Point was put to you fairly that one sees under legibility lack of significant landmark buildings. One has to look at it in the context of inappropriate and out of scale built form as well. When one considers all those factors in the round, what view do you take about the recommendation or the indication there's a lack of significant landmark buildings as identified in the study?
Well, the study clearly identifies that there is a lack of landmark buildings.
Thank you very much. And just finally, you were taken to viewpoint 20, which we don't need to go to, as a point which was on the way into town centre after you'd been on the station forecourt. Do you remember that?
Yes.
Obviously, this is a matter for the inspector to consider having regard to his site visit, but if you put yourself on the station forecourt itself, can you just explain to him what you would ask him to take away from what the viewer sees and from the forecourt, and how the appeal proposal would benefit or otherwise the experience of the viewer in that location?
Well, I think that what the inspector should take away is that essentially when you stand on the forecourt, essentially you're presented with the sort of almost the blank facade of the Colours nightclub, almost directly opposite where you're positioned on the forecourt. In my view, it isn't, it isn't evident or clear where the sort of town centre is, and certainly I think the sort of the introduction of the building on the site, I think both the taller elements on Market Square, the 15 stories on the southeast corner, and then the higher part on the northwest corner will be evident and will assist in terms of waymarking and leading people into the town centre.
Thank you. Thank you very much, sir. That's the re-examination.
Thank you, Mr. Lynes. I don't have any questions. So before we adjourn for the day, any matters of housekeeping? There's one that I need to raise, which is relative to the dates you were looking at for closing submissions. 6th of December, I'm afraid I'm not available at all that day. So that may be back to your discussions, I think. My apologies.
Sir, are you available that week?
I am. I think it's any day other than the Monday. Let me just confirm that. Yes, availability any day other than Monday the 6th.
We'll need to take that away, sir. Because I know Mr. Edwards had indicated he had other issues. I think we might need to have another huddle. Sir.
I went to an inquiry for the rest of that week after the Monday, so we'll have to have another discussion, I think, Mr. Lyons.
Yes, please. And if we can return to this tomorrow at some stage, and if Mr. Hill can be contacted for his availability so that we include everybody.
Yes, sir. I mean, the one thought that I'll mention now, which is I know Mr. Edwards would prefer strongly to appear to close, but obviously we're concerned that we don't want any closing to be pushed too far into the future, and we may need to revisit appearing in person to close, if otherwise we might be looking at an extended time scale, but we can discuss that outside the inquiry, sir. Yes, I know you mentioned written closings as an option.
It's an option. It's down the scale of last resort almost, that I do prefer to hear closings, and if there are members of the public seeking to follow it, then that's the easiest way for them to follow. So I think in terms of inclusivity, that if we can achieve closings in person, that is by far the preferred solution. Clearly, timetabling is important, because if it's pushed deep into December, then that may mean that I've got issues of overlap with subsequent work. So if you bear those points in mind, I know that finding a day for 4 advocates is never easy in terms of diaries, but I can leave that with you to reflect.
Yes, sir. It may be worth the advocates this afternoon setting up a Zoom call rather than exchanging emails, actually, but I'll reflect on that and I'll contact the other advocates, bearing in mind that Mr. Hill would obviously need to join in this conversation as well in due course.
Indeed. Thank you.
Sure.
Is anything else? No, thank you for the progress this morning, and we resume tomorrow morning at 9:30. Thank you.
Very much, sir.